Hello and welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you. Let's begin with our top story, which is from the United States. However unusual it may be for a former US president, for Donald Trump, it's now a common occurrence. And so Trump is getting ready for yet another trial, and he has made yet another court appearance, this time in New York City, where the former president is set to face trial in a civil fraud case alongside his children and their companies. The trial, in fact, begins today and could have significant implications for Trump and his business empire. As usual, lashing out at the prosecutor, in this case, New York Attorney General Letitia James and Judge Arthur Engoron, who is presiding over the non-jury trial and made the fraud ruling last week, Trump said, "This whole case is a sham. See you in court Monday morning." And he is presently in court. Attorney General Letitia James brought the $250 million lawsuit against Trump last September, alleging that Trump and his co-defendants committed repeated fraud in inflating assets on financial statements to get better terms on commercial real estate loans and insurance policies. Trump inflated his net worth by as much as $3.6 billion in 3 separate years between 2011 and 2021, according to the Attorney General's office. Now, attorneys for Trump have refuted the claims, arguing that asset valuations are highly subjective and that they're still sorting through what the ruling means for the company's future. As we said last week, Manhattan Supreme Court Justice Arthur Engoron in his ruling stated that the defendants were liable for fraudulent practices in inflating the values of their real estate assets. The stakes in this trial are quite high. If found guilty, Trump and his companies may be required to pay substantial damages for their alleged fraudulent business practices. The trial will focus on charges of conspiracy to falsify business records, issuing false financial statements, and insurance fraud. One key point of contention is the recent ruling which cancelled the business certifications of Trump entities involved in this case. This raises questions about how these properties will be dissolved, the potential impact on his assets outside New York State, and whether Trump will attempt to transfer these assets to an out-of-state company. As the trial begins, the list of potential witnesses includes Trump himself, his adult children, and former business associates. While Trump had the option to waive his presence, he expressed his desire to testify. Additionally, figures like Ivanka Trump, Michael Cohen, and Alan Weisselberg are expected to take the stand. In the midst of the civil trial, remember, Donald Trump faces a packed calendar of legal battles, including criminal and civil cases. This even as he remains the Republican frontrunner in the 2024 presidential race. This trial is just one chapter in a complex and ongoing legal saga for the former U.S. president.
Donald Trump and the other defendants have committed persistent and repeated fraud. Last week, we proved that in our motion for summary judgment. Today, we will prove our other claims. My message is simple. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law. And it is my responsibility and my duty and my job to enforce it. The law is both powerful and fragile. And today in court, we will prove our case. I thank you all for being here. And again, justice will prevail.
All right, so what does this case really mean for the Trump business empire? To dissect that, we're now joined by Ramakrishnan Sridharan, consulting editor with News9. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. As always, Sri, welcome back to Global Lens. Letitia James there saying, in no uncertain terms, the message is clear. No matter how powerful you may be, you're not above the law. And Trump, being Trump, has lashed out at the Attorney General, calling the case a sham. We believe that Trump is currently in this particular New York court, where the trial is set to begin today. What more can you share with us on that count? Also, how significant is this case, Sri?
Yes. So Mr. Trump arrived at the courthouse about half an hour back, Neha, where he spoke to the media, but obviously now he's gone in for the hearing. So there's only one sliver of good news for Mr. Trump in this, because the good news is so little, I want to dismiss it up front, which is that this is a civil case, which means he does not face any prison time, unlike all the other cases which he's facing in the US. He will not face any prison time, even if he's found guilty. He'll have to pay financial penalty for this. Now that is the only piece of good news. The bad news are tremendous. One, in September last year itself, the judge on this case had ruled saying that there is evidence of fraud, that Trump and his team have committed fraud in terms of overstating the valuation of their assets. As one example, the judge talked about the famous Mar-a-Lago property that Trump has in Florida, where between 2011 and 2021, Trump organized the assessor there, the property assessor in the state, had valued the property at between 18 to 28 million dollars. But on the Trump organization's books, that particular asset, the Mar-a-Lago asset, was valued anywhere between 350 million to almost as much as 720 million dollars, Neha. So the judge has been really, really angry with the Trump team. In fact, even before Letitia James brought the case, the Trump team had tried to settle this, as they have settled some other tax cases in the past, and saying that we'll pay a penalty, but don't press charges. But Letitia James dismissed that, and this has gone into trial now. So the judge has been so angry with the Trump team and their constant denial in the face of what he thinks is compelling evidence, that he not only took the extraordinary step of basically canceling the certificate of registration of Trump companies, but he has also penalized the lawyers about $7,000 each for the five-member team of Trump's lawyers. So that is how angry the judge is. And today, as the trial begins, Neha, it is not in front of a jury. It is only the judge, Judge Endragon, who's going to basically decide on this. There is no jury that's going to decide whether Trump is guilty or not. So and we already know the judge has said that there is evidence that you have overstated the property of, and you've defrauded banks and insurance companies. So today, when the trial starts, the only issue is how much money will Trump and his organization will have to pay as penalty for having overstated and overvalued the properties. The fact that he and his team have committed financial fraud is not in doubt, Nick.
That his team have committed financial fraud is not in doubt. But, if eventually found guilty, how serious are the consequences likely to be in terms of financial losses? Because some might argue, the shrewd businessman that Trump is, perhaps loss of assets is something that he fears more than even potential prison time. So tell us, what could this actually mean for Donald Trump?
Absolutely, Neha. So that is a big risk. In fact, Letitia James, who responded to Trump team's claim that his valuation ability was actually a mark of his business acumen, his genius, she said this is not the art of the deal, but art of the steal. So those were her words when she described, what the Trump organization was doing with these properties. So now, if he's found guilty and he has to pay, a penalty for the fraudulent practices, then the money could be upwards of $250 million. So that's up to the judge to decide and come up with a sentence. But I believe it could be a minimum of $250 million, because the overvaluation of properties is to the extent of $2.5 billion. So there is some metric which the Attorney General is using to claim a penalty in this case. The other implication for Mr. Trump is that he and his sons and any organization related directly to Trump or indirectly to them will be barred from doing any business in the state of New York, not just the city of New York, but in the state of New York. So earlier, there was a question about, what happens to properties? Can you transfer to some other entity or maybe out of state? No, that's not possible, because once the case has begun, the New York judicial system will have absolute, a say on what happens to these properties, whether these will go into liquidation in case Mr. Trump and his sons are not able to pay the penalties. Will then any of the properties be sold to recover the penalties that is owed to the state? So this is going to be very, very, it's going to be a big blow for Mr. Trump, Neha, because he has always built his personality, the Trump persona is built around the fact that he is a genius businessman, that he can turn anything that he touches into gold. So now with this, if these accusations and these allegations stick, then it's a damage to his reputation personally, although there's no prison time. But the fact that he built his reputation as, America's most successful businessman, a guy who could, knows the deal, I think that is going to take a big hit, Neha.
All right. I wonder if it would be more appropriate to call him America's most successful con man. But then, well, that's my opinion. Thank you, Shri, for all those details. Let's now move on to our next story, which is also from the Big Apple, which is reeling under the aftermath of severe flash flooding that has left parts of the city under water. Governor Kathy Hochul has declared a state of emergency, and Mayor Eric Adams is urging residents to stay home or seek shelter. New York City is facing a crisis as torrential rain continues to pound the northeastern part of the United States. Brooklyn, in particular, has been hit hard, with shocking images and videos showing streets and subways submerged. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority has reported widespread outages and delays in the city's transit system. A severe storm system has stalled over the city, affecting parts of upstate New York, New Jersey and Connecticut, leading to widespread flood watches and warnings. Emergency alerts have been issued, urging residents not to travel unless absolutely necessary. The city has experienced an unprecedented amount of rainfall, with some areas receiving between 2 and 5 inches of rain. This historic event has led to the evacuation of patients and staff at some hospitals in Brooklyn because of power outages. The intense rainfall transformed streets into rivers, stranding vehicles for hours and forcing subway and commuter rail lines to shut down. Flights had to be cancelled or delayed, and a terminal at LaGuardia Airport was evacuated. Governor Kathy Hochul has emphasized the need for preparedness in the face of climate change. She said this was the kind of rain that was once unimaginable, and we called it once in a century storm. But this is the third time since I was sworn in 2 years ago that I've had a once in a century storm, she said. The last time New York City witnessed devastating floods was in September 2021, when over 40 people lost their lives. The region's vulnerability to flash floods is linked to climate change. As rising temperatures and increased rainfall events become more frequent, the impacts of climate change are, of course, increasingly evident from extreme weather events, not just in New York City, but indeed in many other parts of the world as well. Shri, coming back to you, even though the governor says that this has happened at least twice since she was sworn to office, fact of the matter is that this is still largely unfamiliar territory for New Yorkers. How have they been coping with the situation, which clearly is a very grim one?
So, Neha, New York has just had its wettest September in 140 years. So unfortunately for New York, what happened is Storm Ophelia had already dumped a lot of water on the city. So which means your ground was already saturated. There was a lot of water already in the ground. So when this rain, and the rain here dumped again between 2.5 to 5.5 inches of water in different parts of the city. So when that happened, the ground was unable to absorb a lot of the water. And the amount of water that was now rushing into the sewage system was just way too much for the system to handle. And the other thing, Neha, which a lot of people don't know, is that, New York just got lucky. You might ask me, how is it lucky when the entire city is flooded and people are stranded, airport is flooded? It got lucky because the highest amount of rainfall, which is 8.5 inches, did not fall on the city, but it fell offshore. So you can imagine if that 8.5 inches of rainfall that had been dumped on the city, New York would have been like, drowning, Neha. This would have been a complete disaster for the city. So now coming back to New York City as such, Neha, there are some parts of the city which are already submerging. Why are they submerging? They're submerging because, of the natural phenomenon where, when soon after the Ice Age era, there was a land, ice which was on all over the New York area. When that melted, the parts which were, not under the ice, they were slightly, above because of the pressure from the ice. Now, with the ice having melted so many years ago, those, areas are actually beginning to sink. And there are some other parts which are right, basically raising, they're getting raised. So this is again a challenge for the city, where the topography and the sewerage system is not really designed to cope with these changes, although these are on millimeters. But this is significant for the city at a long-term kind of impact, and especially for buildings, Neha. So this is obviously a result of climate change, and the fact, as you mentioned, when you were talking about the story, is that the rains are getting harder, and when they they fall with a larger amount of water because of the low pressure system, and the warmer waters that is adding to the moisture, and there's more rain which is like getting created in the clouds, and when it falls, there's a whole lot of water that falls as rains on the city, Neha.
Well, Shri, I can't help but say this. Till just a few years ago, one would have thought that these sort of things happened only in third world countries. This is the big apple that we are talking about. Look at the state of affairs in New York City. I guess climate change is quite the leveler, isn't it? All right. All right, let's now move on to our next story. And well, this is an unlikely fight that seems to have broken out between Justin Trudeau and Elon Musk. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who would like the world to believe that he's a free speech absolutist, is now in the line of fire for allegedly curbing free speech. And the criticism has come from none other than tech mogul Elon Musk. This comes as the Canadian government takes steps to regulate online streaming services, prompting Musk to accuse Trudeau of crushing free speech, in his words. In the wake of a recent decision by the Canadian government requiring online streaming services to formally register for regulatory controls, journalist and author Glenn Greenwald took to social media to express his concerns. He described Canada's move as one of the world's most repressive online censorship schemes. He wrote, the Canadian government, armed with one of the world's most repressive online censorship schemes, announces that all online streaming services that offer podcasts must formally register with the government to permit regulatory controls. Musk responded to this tweet saying Trudeau is trying to crush free speech in Canada. Shameful. This move has intensified a growing debate over balance between government regulation and individual freedoms. Musk's comment adds fuel to the fire, as he is of course known for his outspoken views. And it's important to note that this isn't the first time that the Trudeau government has faced allegations of curtailing free speech. In February 2022, Prime Minister Trudeau invoked emergency powers for the first time in the country's history during the trucker protests against vaccine mandates. These measures were seen by some as a significant expansion of government authorities, sparking concerns over civil liberties in that country. Now, this latest incident comes against the backdrop of Trudeau's strained ties with India. Trudeau recently accused India of orchestrating the killing of Khalistani terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. India swiftly rejected these claims as absurd and motivated, and demanded evidence that Trudeau support his assertions. Remember, India has repeatedly accused Canada of harboring pro-Khalistani terrorists and extremists. But guess what Justin Trudeau has said every time India has taken up this matter with his government? Well, it is freedom of speech. All right, Shri, let me come to you. Now, even though this is frankly an ongoing debate in multiple countries around the world, including here in India, when it comes to matters of government regulation or controls versus free speech, but since this is Mr. Justin Trudeau that we are talking about, the great upholder of free speech, at least when it comes to Khalistanis, now he is being accused of quote-unquote crushing free speech in his country by none other than Elon Musk. How would you look at this controversy?
So, Neha, the first thing is the Online Streaming Act, which has been just passed. Basically, it requires podcast companies making more than $10 million in annual revenue to register. So a lot of the smaller podcast operators who make less than $10 million a year, and 99.99999% of podcast companies don't make more than $10 million a year. So which is why Mr. Musk is also peeved, because Twitter is obviously a company which makes more than $10 million a year. So he would come under this regulation. But that said, there's absolutely no business for any government to get into what media should say or do in terms of the content. So this is being done under the guise of inclusion, of benefiting Canada, benefiting the diverse communities. So basically, the Canadian government has taken on the role of someone who will, in some sense, guide the content that podcast companies should be putting out so that the community is better. Now, that's a very superfluous kind of a reason because it doesn't really hold water. Because I think journalists and independent journalists, responsible journalists know what they're doing, and the free market in terms of the content consumption, I think is strong enough, it's robust enough for people to reject something that's not good enough. So I don't think there's any need for the government to get in and say, okay, your content must be shared this way because we think this is what will benefit the Canadian people. So that is absolutely none of the government's business. And that applies to Canada as well in this case. The other thing to know is that despite being a free country, Neha, Canada regulates its media quite a lot. For example, if you're first of all, if you're a broadcaster or you are a media company, you cannot have properties that have more than 45% of the Canadian viewership. So if you're catering to more than 45% of the Canadian market, people who are there, then you have to divest some assets. The other restriction is if you're operating in a particular market or a region, you can either, you cannot own three things, which is you can't have television, you can't have print and radio together. So you can only have two of these. You can either have radio and television or radio and print. You can't have all three. So despite being a free market, Canada does have a history of basically regulating its media and ownership. There are a lot of restrictions. It's not like the US, for example, where pretty much you're free to own whatever you want to do, and the market forces decide. So this does not show Canada in a great light. I mean, this attempt to basically control or censor podcasts, because ultimately most of the podcasts, the ones which people consume, are smaller podcasts. And people should have the freedom to express their opinions, especially if the Prime Minister keeps saying that this is all about free speech. We guarantee freedom to our citizens, and if they're allowing all kinds of violence to take place under the name of free speech, then this is actually, it makes no sense at all, Neha.
Exactly. So, Shri, it wouldn't be incorrect to say, while of course you're right in pointing out that this is Canada that has had such policies over a long time, but Justin Trudeau in particular seems to define freedom of expression very selectively based entirely on his convenience.
It does look so, Neha, and that is unfortunate. I think maybe the Canadian people will think, or probably they already think differently from the Prime Minister, and maybe we'll get to see their point of view when the elections come around in 2025.
I really wonder what the Indian government would have to say about Elon Musk accusing Justin Trudeau of crushing freedom of speech. I mean, here's a man who has let, all kinds of violence happen right under his nose, all in the name of free speech. We are, of course, referring to the Khalistani issue. All right, let's now move on to our next story, which is on the important elections that have just concluded in the Maldives. Let's get you a complete lowdown on those presidential polls. Now, opposition candidate Mohammad Muizzu has emerged as the winner, securing the presidency in a second-round runoff against the incumbent Maldivian president Ibrahim Solih. This outcome could potentially signal a significant shift in the Maldives' foreign policy towards China away from its traditional partner, India. Muizzu said, and I quote, "Today the people made a strong decision to win back the independence of the Maldives. Now, in a closely watched election, Mohammad Moizu has won the presidential race with 54% of the votes, according to the Election Commission. His opponent, President Soleh, could only manage to get 46% of the votes. The voter turnout was impressive, with approximately 85% of the 282,000 eligible voters participating in the polls. The Maldives saw voting take place across 187 islands. During his time in power, President Soleh championed an India-first policy, fostering strong ties with India. However, the coalition supporting Moizu has a history of supporting Chinese loans and investment projects. The change in leadership may herald a closer relationship between the Maldives and China, a development that could have significant implications for the Indian Ocean region. Now, Moizu has called on President Soleh to release former President Abdullah Yameen, who has close ties to him and is currently serving an 11-year prison term for corruption and money laundering. Yameen's supporters argue that the charges against him were politically motivated. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has congratulated President-elect Moizu. In his message, Prime Minister Modi affirmed India's commitment to strengthening the long-standing India-Maldives bilateral relationship and enhancing overall cooperation in the Indian Ocean region. Now, here's something important to remember. India's relations with the Maldives went through a period of turmoil during Yameen's tenure. But there was a considerable thawing of relations under Soleh. Now, in 2020, Maldives-India ties had to contend with what was called the India Out campaign that initially started as on-ground protests in the Maldives and later spread widely across social media platforms using the phrase with the related hashtag. The Maldives has long been under India's sphere of influence. Maintaining its presence there gives New Delhi the ability to monitor a key part of the Indian Ocean. China, with its rapidly expanding naval forces, would want access to such a strategically important location, something that India certainly would like to prevent. Beijing is also keen to protect its energy supplies from the Gulf, which pass through this route. Both Delhi and Beijing have given the Maldives hundreds of millions of dollars in the form of loans and grants for infrastructure and development projects. Strategically located in the Indian Ocean, the Maldives archipelago, comprising 1,200 coral islands, lies next to key shipping lanes which ensure uninterrupted energy supplies to countries like China, Japan and India. Now, since China started to send naval ships to the Indian Ocean about a decade ago and right up to the Gulf of Aden, in the name of anti-piracy operations, the Maldives' significance has in fact steadily grown and now is at the heart of international geopolitics in some ways. As the preeminent South Asian power and a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region, India needs to cooperate with the Maldives in security and defense sectors. China's massive economic presence in the Maldives is a major concern for India. With the country now said to owe 70% of its external aid to China, many believe that Yameen has done to the Maldives what Rajapaksa did to Sri Lanka. Of course, the question now is, what will the new president do to India-Maldives ties? All right, let's take this back to Shri. Shri, whatever happens politically in the Maldives is of great interest and concern to New Delhi for reasons that I have just outlined briefly. The fact that the new incumbent is somebody who's seen as having very close ties with China is not exactly, a dream scenario for New Delhi. How do you think this is likely to pan out? And how concerned do you think New Delhi is likely to be?
So, Neha, it's important to remember there are two issues on which Moizu fought the election this time around. One was on the economic problems that Maldives is facing and the related corruption, which has been holding that country back. And number two is basically India's military presence, as he calls it, military presence. I'll explain that's actually not a military presence, but I'll explain that in a little bit. So the other thing to remember, Neha, is that Mr. Moizu is the protege of Abdullah Yameen. So he was not even a contender, he was a wild card entrant in some sense into the presidential election, but he's now become the president. So the point is whether he can operate independently of Mr. Yameen will be the big question. And as you said, Mr. Yameen is basically the one who who went pro-China. And when Soleil came, he made it India first, right? He tilted the scales towards India. Under Moizu, I think something different is going to happen because prior to 2018, when Abdullah Yameen was there, it was all about China. But things have changed since 2018 in some sense, and the most important thing is basically the presence of US in Maldives directly. So US has opened a mission in Malé, which will service the people of Malé in terms of visas and all the other issues. Until now, it was being serviced out of Sri Lanka. So what happens now is basically what Muzu will want to do is basically strike a balance between India and China. And he will do so in terms of saying that, okay, I'm going to go and get the best from both these countries rather than aligning with one, either becoming pro-China or becoming pro-India. I'm going to maintain cordial relations with both and try to get the best bargain from both these countries. So he will probably want to play this off. And don't forget, there's also now the US, which is there physically in Malé, watching over this much more closely. So US will not want Maldives to move too close to China. So that is going to be a factor which was not there, Neha, before 2018. Now, coming to this whole point about India's so-called military presence, I think that is exaggerated, because what India has done is basically given Maldives a couple of helicopters, one aircraft for its Coast Guard, and I believe there are 75 people who have been deployed for the maintenance of this fleet. So now there is essentially not an army which has been deployed in Maldives. But anyway, that is what has been conveyed to the people of Maldives, and they have voted to bring this government into power. So I think for India, we will have to. Prime Minister Modi has congratulated the new winner in the elections, Mr. Moizu. So I think India will want to work very closely with Maldives, despite the change in government, because Maldives as a natural ally of India for decades. India was the first country to recognize Maldives when it became independent. So India has very, very close ties, and I don't think Maldives will also want to go to a point where it antagonizes India completely, especially now that the US is present on ground. So it's going to be some sort of a balance between India and China, with the intention of maximizing the benefits for the people of Maldives, for the country of Maldives, which from a Maldivian perspective, Neha, is not really a bad thing.
From the Maldivian perspective, it is not really a bad thing. But, when you talk about how Moizu is likely to strike more of a balance, you mentioned that he is Yameen's protege, and Yameen, in fact, inflicted a lot of damage on India-Maldives ties, with the India Out campaign being front and center. Yes, there is the American presence that you refer to, but how do you think going ahead India is likely to deal with the evolving scenario?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, Neha, because as you know, everything is in a lot of flux. I mean, new events happen, and then the existing equation gets disturbed, and then we have to scramble to find a new kind of an equation, a way to deal with things. So I'm sure India would have already, thought about this. And I think India will anyway want to maintain its presence with the help of US in this region, and to make sure that China does not, build up some sort of an excessive presence in this market, despite the projects which are being executed under the Belt and Road Initiative. India is also helping build Maldivian infrastructure. So I think India will keep that pressure up. It will keep the assistance up so that it continues to have some sort of a say in Maldives. I don't think India is going to walk away from Maldives just because there's a pro-China, or at least a protege of a pro-China leader is now in power in Maldives, Neha.
Well, the stakes couldn't be higher. On that note, Sri, as always, a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for your perspective.
Thank you for having me, Neha.
Look forward to having you back on the show tomorrow, Sri. All right, on that note, time for a quick break here on Global Lens. But don't go anywhere. There's lots more on the other side. Stay tuned.
With all this gear, you must be wondering if I'm climbing a mountain. Well, let me give you a wider look of this place. This is Asia's largest